In 2014, a 30-year-old founder graced the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and Inquiry magazine in the same year. She was called the next Steve Jobs. Her company was valued at $9 billion. She personally was worth an estimated $4.5 billion on paper, making her, at the time, the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. Her company's technology could supposedly run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. No needles, no labs, just a finger prick and results in minutes. The technology never worked, not in 2014, not ever. For over a decade, almost no one outside the company knew that. Board members included 2 former U.S. Secretaries of State, a former Secretary of Defense, and a former CEO of Wells Fargo. This is the story of how Elizabeth Holmes built one of the most convincing frauds in corporate history, and how it finally fell apart. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003 at age 19 to found a company called Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Her pitch was genuinely compelling, and it's worth understanding why it worked. Blood testing in the early 2000s required drawing multiple vials of blood, sending them to centralized labs, and waiting days for results. The process was expensive, uncomfortable, and inaccessible for many people, especially those managing chronic conditions who needed frequent testing. Holmes proposed a device, eventually called the Edison, that could run over 200 different tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick, with results available almost instantly at a fraction of the cost of traditional lab testing. If it worked, it would have been one of the most significant healthcare innovations in decades. Earlier diagnosis of diseases, cheaper testing for underserved communities, no more dreaded needles. The idea was so compelling that Holmes raised early funding from prominent venture capitalists without, and this is the detail that matters, without the technology being demonstrated working at scale. By 2010, Theranos had raised over $400 million. By 2014, that figure exceeded $700 million, and the company was valued at $9 billion. Holmes cultivated a public image deliberately modeled on Steve Jobs, the black turtleneck, the deep voice she reportedly adopted intentionally, the Stanford dropout turned visionary narrative. The press loved it, investors loved it. The story was almost too good. Here's what almost no one outside Theranos knew during those years. The Edison device the company was famous for, essentially, never worked reliably. Internal whistleblowers later testified that the device could only perform a small fraction of the 200-plus tests it was marketed as capable of, and even those results were frequently inaccurate. So how did Theranos run blood tests for actual patients, which it began doing through partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway, starting around 2013? According to court testimony and investigative reporting, for the vast majority of tests, Theranos secretly used modified versions of traditional, commercially available blood analyzers, the exact centralized lab equipment Theranos claimed to be replacing, diluting blood samples to work with the smaller sample sizes, which often produced unreliable results. In other words, the revolutionary technology wasn't running the tests. Conventional machines, used in ways they weren't designed for, were. Employees who raised concerns internally described a culture of intense secrecy and fear. Lab results that came back abnormal, sometimes dangerously so, were reportedly given to real patients making real medical decisions based on tests run on equipment that wasn't validated for accuracy. The company's chief operating officer at the time, Sunny Balwani, who was also secretly in a relationship with Holmes, something not disclosed to the board, has been described in court testimony as enforcing an environment where employees were discouraged from questioning results, under threat of legal action via aggressive non-disclosure agreements. For years, this all stayed hidden, through a combination of carefully staged demonstrations for investors, board members without relevant scientific backgrounds, and a press that rarely asked the hardest technical questions. The unraveling began in October 2015, when a Wall Street Journal investigation, built on information from former Theranos employees, revealed that the company was using traditional lab equipment for the vast majority of its tests, not its proprietary Edison devices. The story also raised serious concerns about the accuracy of results that real patients had received and acted on. Theranos's initial response was aggressive denial. Holmes appeared on television, calling the reporting false and accused the journalists of being misled by disgruntled former employees. But regulators didn't ignore it. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted an inspection of Theranos's lab and found deficiencies serious enough to pose what they described as immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Theranos was banned from operating blood testing labs for 2 years. Walgreens terminated its partnership. Safeway, which had already invested approximately $350 million into a planned in-store clinic rollout that never launched, quietly walked away. By 2017, the company's value, once $9 billion, was effectively zero. Investors who had put in hundreds of millions of dollars lost essentially everything. In 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and Balwani with massive fraud. Criminal charges followed. After a trial that lasted months and included testimony from former employees, investors, and patients, Holmes was convicted in January 2022 on 4 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison and began serving her sentence in 2023. The Theranos story gets told as a story about one person's lies, and at its core, it is that. But it's also a story about how an entire ecosystem, investors, board members, journalists, and partners, can collectively fail to ask basic questions, as long as the story being told is compelling enough. Theranos's board included some of the most powerful people in American politics and business. Almost none of them had a background in laboratory science or medical diagnostics. They were chosen, prosecutors argued, for their names and credibility, not their ability to evaluate whether the technology actually worked. Major investors reportedly conducted minimal technical due diligence, in some cases relying on demonstrations that were later revealed to have been staged. This is sometimes called fake it until you make it culture, common and often harmless in early-stage tech startups building software. But Theranos wasn't building an app. It was making medical decisions for real patients based on technology that didn't work. The line between aggressive startup optimism and outright fraud isn't always obvious from the outside, but it becomes very obvious the moment people's health is on the line. And there's no way to fake a blood test result that a doctor then uses to treat or fail to treat an actual disease. Elizabeth Holmes is currently serving her sentence. Theranos no longer exists. The technology that was supposed to revolutionize healthcare never materialized. Not from Theranos, and as of today, not from anyone else either. The problem Holmes claimed to have solved in 2003 remains, for the most part, unsolved. If you want to understand how some of the biggest frauds and failures in business history actually happened, subscribe. There's a new story every week. And if today's video made you curious about the psychology behind how people convince themselves and others that something is true when it isn't, I've linked a book in the description, Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, the journalist whose reporting broke this story open. It's the definitive account of what really happened inside Theranos. Link is below.